Hey there, how are y'all doing? So today I'm going to be talking about the 2003 movie Head of State, directed by Chris Rock. Now, just from hearing that, you can probably tell where this movie is going to go, but it still proves to be a worthwhile ride, even if it is a predictable premise. So what's so special about this movie anyway? Well, for one thing, it not only features Chris Rock, but it also features Bernie Mac. God rest his soul. He really was one of those people that actually made me laugh. I guess there are quite a few people out there that do that, but Bernie Mac seemed to, I don't know, strike gold pretty much anytime he said something. Um, Even in those kinds of movies that you think are going to be so awful, they at least have that saving grace of Bernie Mac, if they're lucky enough, of course. Anyway, this movie basically has these presidential candidates, they're president and vice president of a specific party, um, have their planes run into each other. The formation for this plot is, I'll admit, kind of shoddy. It's just kind of a slapdash rush to to get Chris Rock into the limelight as a presidential candidate. And they quite literally pick him out because he's an alderman of Washington, D.C., of one of the very ghetto, in their words, not mine, districts of DC. And they talk about how you could get shot while you're getting shot. Just to get the idea there. So what makes this movie work? Well, I would say really it's the chemistry between Chris Rock and Bernie Mac, and I also think that because Chris Rock directed this movie, he made his character look as favorable and as wisecracking as possible, and that proved a worthwhile investment for this movie. Granted, there are a few things that are kind of questionable and kind of about it, but overall, I really think it's a fun ride. And so, I obviously have a bit of a bias with this movie, but what makes this movie work on a more technical point, say? Well, you have these characters that you actually like and you actually enjoy spending time with. You have Chris Rock's former girlfriend, and you may as well just call him Chris Rock. He's Mace Gilliam in the movie, but that doesn't really matter. It's pretty much just Chris Rock being Chris Rock here. You have his former girlfriend who leaves him in the midst of everything going wrong in this guy's life. This poor alderman, Mace Gilliam. He pretty much gets evicted from his place. He is no longer the alderman. He tends to dress very lowly, not upper class. Even Puff Daddy wears a suit of court, and you can tell based on that joke, what time of life Diddy is in, or P. Diddy, or Puff Daddy, or whatever the hell his name is. Does it really matter? Meh. Not enough for me to hate this movie. If anything, it makes me smile a little more. I should also mention that this is actually a movie where Tracy Morgan is in it, and he makes me laugh. I usually can't stand that guy. He annoys me to no end, but in this movie, he actually makes me laugh. He's not the best thing about this movie. He's this guy that sells meat. He really has no actual reason for selling meat, and it's a stupid premise, but it's still a funny premise nonetheless. So that's definitely a plus for this movie. You can tell this is a movie that does not take itself very seriously. Occasionally it'll dabble into some political talk and have those serious moments, but there's no way that this movie should be the kind of movie that's taken as I don't know, stoic, serious, no fun here. No, this movie is all fun. With maybe a touch of drama, for the sake of moving the plot forward. You have basically this setup of Chris Rock so that the party can move forward and a certain guy can appease to the minorities and, become the actual presidential candidate for this election after Mays Gilliam. They just want to sucker him in basically to get the minority vote. They don't actually care about him. So you get this sense of feeling used, and I'll get to the parallels in terms of how things are politically. But anyway, you have that drama, but then you have the campaign manager, Deborah, who feels bad after getting to know Mays, and they even actually have an arc of her being frustrated and calling him an ignorant ass brother. Okay, ninja, whatever, that word that I'd get persecuted if I ever said. But it's a colloquial term, the N word. There you go. And and Chris Rock just looks at her and he's just like, I know you didn't call me an ignorant ass brother and think you're gonna stay on this campaign bus with me. No, that's not happening. And he throws her off and he goes into this very, quote, dark stage of his, and I realize I could probably make it more of a pun with that, but that's not really what I meant. I just mean dark in terms of tumultuous and intense and brooding. He's not very happy. You can see like storm clouds forming above his head. Let's put it that way. And you get this sense that he just wants to go straight into the stereotype of what every other black guy has been caricatured out to be. And in some respects, I can get that. He doesn't think he can defeat the system, therefore he wants to become a part of the system. But honestly, getting very philosophical about this movie isn't really worth it. Not because there isn't material to garner out of it, but that's not what this movie was intended for. This was more of a comedic take on what would happen if Chris Rock was president. Now, getting into these parallels of what happened, this movie was released in 2003. This is before Barack Obama was elected president. I won't say everything has turned into complete 100% progress, but what I will say is that it was viewed even at the time that there wasn't gonna be a black president anytime soon. And there's a line in the movie where Chris Rock looks at one of his other campaign heads and says, you represent yourself. Me, I represent my whole race. If I don't get this presidential spot, they're not going to elect another black guy or even nominate him for another 50 years. And then, of course, that premise gets, disproved in real life 5 years later, but that's not the point. That for the time being, that concept made and kind of makes sense, to be honest with you. It's hard to tell just where things are headed in the political culture of the United States. Now, of course, if you're not in the United States, it's kind of hard for me to really tell you just exactly what's going on that wouldn't be the exact same thing you've been hearing all over the internet. So I'll leave that be to the internet. That's not really my spot. My spot here is just talking about how this premise for a movie could not work now and be taken with a straight face, because this movie was actually made when a black president was not in the works. But now it is in the works. Or maybe Chris Rock realized that Barack Obama was just a puppet for Democrats to... Oh, God. Are you listening to me seriously? Oh, you can't believe everything you hear. Come on. This is a movie review anyway, so I'm going to get back to that. So what are my favorite things about this movie? Well, I would probably have to attribute that to, a few things. For one thing, I am a sucker for a movie that has a mostly hip-hop and rap soundtrack. It doesn't really matter what kind of movie that is. I am a sucker for that kind of soundtrack. Now, of course, the quality of the movie plays into how I feel about the movie, but I'm always in a better mood if I love the soundtrack. And in this case, it's great. I mean, you have this scene in the movie where they're actually playing Hot in Here by Nelly, because that was really big around that time. And Chris Rock is the DJ, and he talks about how the roof is on fire at this fundraiser. And they literally think the roof is on fire, and then they just start evacuating the entire fundraiser. And you're just shaking your head like, oh, that's crazy and absurd, but I love it. You also have the Bonnie and Clyde, Beyonce and Jay Z version. Read it into that way you will, but from the '03, also really big around that time. I think what they probably did honestly is they probably just took the biggest hits that they would consider in a quote black movie or a hip hop movie, even though this really isn't a black movie or hip hop movie in the same way that Who's Your Caddy was that way. This film is much more competent than Who's Your Caddy, but it is in a sense a film talking about the oppression of blacks and talking about the minorities versus the majority. And in that sense, there is that sense of conflict between the races. Though, as I said before, this movie plays it more on the levity side as opposed to being too serious. The other thing I like about this movie is the quick quips that Chris Rock has. And he's saving this woman out of a house fire, and she is convinced that they're not going to blow her house up, but they're going to inadvertently or accidentally blow it up because the timer stopped working, the explosives got set, whatever. And he goes into this whole monologue with this lady, and you swear they're out of time, but apparently they're not. Movie logic, I guess. And he talks about how they gave Magic Johnson AIDS and they turned Michael Jackson white. Do you think they give a damn about you? And it's and of course that finally gets her out of this darn house that they're gonna offer her 40 grand for. And he looks at them and he says, what is she gonna buy for 40 grand? A crack house? Like, not the best joke out there, obviously, but it's one of those jokes that makes you think, yeah, that is a pretty crummy deal. Yeah, that's pretty terrible. This movie does have something else in common with Who's Your Caddy. It also has Tamala Jones as the love interest in this movie. And this one is more believable for her, I would say. In Who's Your Caddy, she was essentially the attorney for the country club owner, and she really could not stand Big Boy. And she was supposedly wooed by him and his mother making fried chicken. No, that's really in the movie. And supposedly that was not intentional, and at this point it doesn't really matter. But the point is, she is a much more convincing love interest in Head of State. She tells Mays, Chris Rock, to run his race, and she actually provides a solid form of encouragement, and you can actually believe the romance between those two. And she also, of course, works at the main gas station that Chris Rock goes to beforehand, and she also works as a caterer at this fundraiser, the one where he turned the party out with the Nelly song "Hot in Her." That official title name is very silly for that song, even though I love it. Anyway, you have this campaign staff of Deborah Lasseter. You also have the guy that's in the Spider-Man movies. He's kind of dweebish. He like owns the store. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. But he's actually really good in this movie too. And even though Deborah Lasseter gets angry at him and calls him the ignorant ass ninja, you end up having this other guy come in and reach out to Maze in his time of need, his time of desperate need. You have Bernie Mac in this movie, who's a riot, as I said before, and he convinces Chris Rock to make this his campaign and not let these other people, ride him around and tell him how things are going to be. Now, this movie tends to interpret that as make it more hip hop and not all of these old figures. If someone tried to personify this today, I would say that some of the writers for the Hamilton play, or the ones that are making this all come together, the producers and the writers and all that jazz, they may have had their starting outs here. Who knows? Probably not. You would have this progression of this other candidate for the other party who is, you know what? I have to admit, until Donald Trump came into office, I didn't think this person actually existed. But if you watch this guy in this movie, you'll get quite a perspective of like this buffoon running for office. And his entire shtick is that he was vice president for 8 years and that he's Sharon Stone's cousin, and they make damn sure that he's Sharon Stone's cousin. And then plot twist, Sharon Stone ends up endorsing Mace Gilliam, which is pretty funny. Now, why they were so bent on having Sharon Stone's name, I don't know. Did Sharon Stone donate? You can let me know if you want. It doesn't really matter to me. But it is pretty funny how this Sharon Stone is pretty shoehorned in to this movie. But it does prove for that funny joke in the end when she switches to Mace Gilliam, even though she is this vice president's cousin. And this guy's a monster. And he always ends his speeches with basically, and God made America great and no place else. And you can start seeing where that whole make America great again. Look, I'm really not mentioning this because I have certain political affiliations one way or the other. I am just mentioning this because it's quite hilarious how this movie has quite a few parallels to what ended up happening. You don't necessarily have Barack Obama being nominated because he was black, but you have this noted interest of how the minority population is rising, which was mentioned in the movie and is happening in reality. You have a much firmer support of this political party, statistically speaking, anyway, if you're not Caucasian and if you're not male. And even though the not male part doesn't really play into this movie, that doesn't really get addressed at all. But this is more of a comedic movie. It's not trying to address everything. It's only trying to address one or two things at most. And you also have this over-the-top, just awful opposing candidate. Mitt Romney wasn't really that way, and even the other nominees that were up against Obama weren't really that bad. But you can kind of see the cartoonish nature in Donald Trump. And whether or not you agree with what he's doing, when you watch this movie, you can at least see some of those traits. And I don't think that was intentional on Trump's end. Let's put it that way. All that aside, what does this movie achieve? Or what is it trying to achieve? And what does it achieve? To me, it seems like a project for Chris Rock to make some money, but also to play president for a day. Or for a year, who knows? And you have Bernie Mac, who, as I said before, sadly isn't with us anymore, but you have him providing his wit. You have Tamala Jones, who seems to be a staple of a large number of what some would call hip-hop movies and what I would call movies that aren't the standard with its soundtrack. I think the movie really worked with that it's a tad bit dated. I know giving it's not really supposed to be negative statements, but my point is I understand that it's a bit dated, but I still think the premise works because it wasn't dated at the time, and it does show some of that anguish and frustration and racial conflict, even if it's not trying to be a philosophical movie by any means. I think a lot of the writing is great. I think it's a very fun and enjoyable movie. I think you can actually watch something political and not feel like you're taking a bunch of downers. I think that's really great, especially in this day and age. And I would say that if I had to give this movie a grade, I'd probably, on my likability of the story, an A minus. In terms of like official plot and story elements and the making of the movie, I'd probably lean towards a B plus. So probably around that 90% vibe of what I think worked. I don't think it's the best movie of all time by any means, but I think it's a splendid movie, and I think it's a very fun and enjoyable movie. And I feel that this is going to be the most political I get. So this was my way of saying I acknowledge that politics exist, but I'm going to let the rest of the internet talk, and if I want to pursue action in my community, I'm going to go out there and make a difference. And I encourage you to do the same. All right. So this was relatively fun, and I think it was much needed. And I hope you all have a great day now. All right. Bye.